Welcome, welcome. Well, this is going to be a presentation where I go over what I see as the major changes that we're witnessing right now. That I think everyone, even on the left and the right, are pinpointing similar things that are happening in society right now. That looks like a fundamental shift, a fundamental transformation in the way the economy, politics, and society is structured. But I think there's a lot of bad analysis around what's going on, and there's a lot of um, outdated memes and themes that are being used to describe what we're witnessing. So this will be as much a chance for me to present how I see the world, to give some definitions of some of the things I generally talk about as anything else, and it will be an opportunity to show where I think some of the other analysis fails. Now, as you can see, the first slide I've included big scary Klaus Schwab, and this ties into what I'm talking about. We're all witnessing the same thing, which is, in very basic terms, we're witnessing consolidation of power by the oligarchs. I think everyone agrees on that. There's constantly news stories that are coming up to highlight this. The one that made me decide to make this video was the news going around that Bill Gates is the largest private landowner in the US now. But you have Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. They're both worth around $200 billion now. I think Elon Musk has become the richest man in the world. And at the same time, there's all this talk of World Economic Forum and economic restructuring and so on. And what it's all pointed in the direction of is consolidation of power by a global elite, and everyone else kind of being left in a sort of subservient position to them, with the hollowing out of the middle class. Now, is that communism? Is that fascism? The most popular way to describe this on the right and in national circles seems to be that it's a globalist communist takeover. At the same time, you see a lot of conservatives and a lot of left-wingers describing this as fascism. And I think both of these fail. This is the quote that's always going around from Mussolini, supposedly. It's actually a fake quote, that fascism is the merger of the state and corporate power. So is fascism when international capitalists hijack the state? Conservatives were sharing this after Trump got banned from Twitter, that this was the perfect instantiation of fascism. No theorist of fascism ever saw it as being about handing over the power of the state to internationalist, globalist financial elites. Fascism was formulated as a response, rejection of the power of internationalist financial elites. So I think that's obviously absurd, and just using fascism as a fill-in for authoritarian or tyrannical is equally lacking. But maybe the more popular one is the idea that communism is when capitalists monopolize everything. This is a popular one on the right, that because the USSR and other examples was a small oligarchy of party officials, of communist bureaucrats that controlled every aspect of people's lives, that communism applies to what we're witnessing now, because communism is just when a handful of people sort of monopolize everything and make society their slaves. Well, that's not what communism ever was in terms of how it was formulated. Communism was about democratizing the means of production. It was not about having, it was about having no monopolists. It was about having no private property, everything owned in commune. So, people would say, well, that might have been how Marx formulated it, but he was a Freemason and a liar, and it was all a plot to get oligarchy created by using the masses. And you can say that, but then at that stage, if you're just going to use the word communism to refer to any tyrannical oligarchy, I think at that point, the word communism ceases to have any meaning. And look, the people that are doing this aren't communists. Klaus Schwab's whole deal is like ethical stakeholder capitalism. Jeff Bezos is not a communist. Mark Zuckerberg is not influenced by Das Kapital. I think this is equally as absurd as the fascism one, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to go away. I think a lot of people think that, and I've actually heard people say this, that, well, I don't think it's communism, but it's useful to kind of use that language because you can like whip up Red Scare stuff amongst conservatives and amongst normies. My attitude is that we should tell the truth, and that if we're giving a bad analysis out of some sort of a marketing mindset about bringing people in, I think that's destined to backfire. And I don't think it helps us to be just trying to attract people on the basis of a sort of conservative world outlook and focusing on like 1960s Red Scare stuff. I mean, come on, it's not communism. This is not about democratizing the means of control and having an equal society. This is a handful of people generating obscene wealth at the expense of everyone else. Now, for me, I describe this as capitalism, and the move to the more bureaucratic form with things like the World Economic Forum that people will reference, and the growing power of the state in aiding capitalists. I just see this as technocratic, a more managerial form of capitalism. But this begs the question, what is capitalism? Because people say, well, if you're against capitalism, then obviously you're a communist, and capitalism is just free trade. It's being allowed to go to the supermarket and buy groceries. That's not my definition of capitalism. Capitalism is not the market. Capitalism existed, or rather, the market existed prior to capitalism. We had thousands and thousands of years of markets, but capitalism was something that was instantiated a few centuries ago. It's clearly something different from just the ability to trade. And that gets to the question of what is capital. Capital is sometimes seen as it's equated with money, but capital isn't a thing. Rather, it's a process in which money is perpetually sent in search of more money. And this is why with capitalism, as I've discussed in another video about why exponential growth is necessary to capitalism, there's been compound growth rate consistently since capitalism's instantiation of about 3 or 4% a year. And that's because it needs that in order to survive, because the coercive law of competition sends everyone in search of growth in order to outcompete their competitors. And in a society dominated by capital, that's what you get. It becomes this exponential growth machine. So my definition of capitalism is simply a system in which capital controls the direction of society. Capitalism has taken many forms: production capitalism, finance capitalism, merchant capitalism, rentier capitalism. And again, this is where confusion comes in, because people will say, well, how is this capitalism? People don't own houses as much as they used to. They have this sort of 1950s vision of capitalism where, there's a nuclear family and everyone owns a home and a car, and there's a quite a stable social organization. But it's mistaken to try and freeze time and think that one epoch of capitalism, liberalism, can be sort of frozen in time, because capital is a fluid process by definition. It's perpetually in search of growth. And so these social relations that capitalism generates at one particular period of time are only ever temporary. And, finance capitalism, rentier capitalism, which I'll talk about later on, is as natural a form of capitalism as production capitalism. And it isn't really a solution to say, well, we'll just go back to production capitalism. Because capital has gone in a direction where that no longer satisfies its need for growth. And this is why I think it's important to get these definitions down, because at the implicit in blaming all of this on communism and the state is the idea that what's latent in that is that there's a form of capitalism and liberalism that's fine, and we just need to get back to that. We just need to get rid of the excessive state interference. We just need to root out the radical leftists in academia. We just need to get rid of the secret communist billionaires, and then we can have a healthy form of production capitalism. And this is what I think is the problem, is you fall back into this sort of reactionary mindset where you fail to take account a satisfactory way of the structures that are leading to our problems, and you just start blaming individuals, you just start blaming infiltration or something, and I think it becomes a rather unsatisfactory answer. So what I would describe some of the processes we're witnessing, and this isn't a term coined by me or anything, but neo-feudalism is, I think, a good label for the direction that capitalism is moving in now, and it may even be capitalism's final form. So neo-feudalism, and feudalism is quite hard to define, but it was primarily defined by sets of economic relationships. And there's things to recommend about feudalism. A return to feudalism doesn't sound like a terrible idea, but this isn't a return to feudalism. This is certain economic aspects of feudalism that the direction of capitalism is now mimicking. So you have extreme inequality, both between the rich and the poor, and a sharp urban-rural divide. You have the obvious one, the extreme power of oligarchs. You have the division of sovereignty. You have the blending of public and private. You've platform capitalism and the rentier economy. I'm going to get into all of this. So, two Americas, two worlds. Now, the first time I started thinking about the sort of feudal nature of what's going on is last year. I remember when Elon Musk launched one of his rockets into space. And this was, this was in all the science journals and so on. This was such a tremendous advance that was being made. But this actually happened at the same time. This happened at the same time as there was cities being burned out in America. It was at the height of the BLM riots. We were watching shopping malls being looted, police cars were being burned out, people were being attacked. It was total chaos. And everyone was talking about civil war, secession, at the end of an empire collapse. But at the same time as all this stuff was going on, everyone was talking about the end of America. You have Elon Musk, who is very sort of emblematic of like futurism and the brave new world that we're moving into and progress. And he's at the forefront of human ingenuity and technology. So there's this sharp contrast that we're seeing more and more under this economic system of, in this case, two Americas, but more generally two worlds. The super rich and everyone else are really inhabiting two different worlds, two different sets of social values. And for the super rich, things have never been better. Things are good. There's reason to be optimistic. There's reason to buy into the Steven Pinker view of the world. While for everyone else, there's increasing angst. People are talking about catastrophe, about collapse, about civil war, all these kinds of things. So this contrast is sharper than I think it has ever been. And this is perpetuated by the huge inequality. You can see that 26 billionaires now own half of the world's wealth. It was 61 in 2016. It was 43 in 2017. So you can see gradually the world's wealth is being consolidated by fewer and fewer and fewer people. And that gives them a greater potential to plan. At the same time, economic income gains to the top 1%. Some statistics from 54 to 57, 5% of gains went to the top 1%, which I think we would say is quite equitable and maybe manageable. 75 to 79, it was 25%. And now, 2009, 2012, 95% of the world's wealth went to the top 1%. And I'd imagine that that's shrinking even now. We have I think most people remember the news story last year about Jeff Bezos making $13 billion in a day. And that was a time when many small and medium-sized businesses were going out of business, at the same time as his workers are paid a quite paltry wage. And then we have 10% to 50%, according to some estimates, of the world's wealth is now offshore. So increasingly, the oligarchs are able to avoid taxation. They really are inhabiting a different world. They don't play by the same rules as us anymore. And the more powerful these people become, the more they're able to avoid the taxation burden that everyone else is living with. So this requires a deeper analysis of how things inequality exploded in this way, how the oligarchs became so powerful. Karl Polanyi was an economist who talked about this idea of embedded markets, that prior to the 19th century, markets were embedded and that they were subject to political, social, religious control. There may be places today where embedded markets still exist, perhaps China is an example. But with classical liberalism, that he specifically pinpoints as starting with an 1834 poor law reform that was specifically designed to force the poor into low-paying work rather than getting sustenance from workhouses and so on. That was the beginning of classical liberalism. And it was motivated by the classical liberalism of Jeremy Bentham, the famous utilitarian. And Bentham's utilitarianism led him to believe in the value of a free market, that although the poor would suffer in the short term, it was the best thing for society to force them to starve and to take any work that was available, because it would lead to rising living standards for everyone. So this is the basis for the shift to classical liberalism. Now that order starts to collapse in the 1930s. You have the Great Depression, of course, and deregulation of Wall Street. Britain attempted to go back to the gold standard, and it was a disaster under Churchill. So free market thinking was fundamentally undermined by this time. And then you have things like the Keynesian revolution in economics, John Maynard Keynes' ideas around economic stimulus in times of recession as a way to avoid cycles of recession, depression. His work became very popular. Keynes became probably the most famous economist ever. And at the same time, you have the success of things like the New Deal in the US, and also the economic miracle in Germany in the 1930s. So these were policies that were focused on stimulus, on the heavy involvement of the state giving people work, financing the economy. And so the free market became less important. And so after the Second World War, you have a consensus around that is embedded liberalism. You still have liberalism, but now it's moderated by welfare state, by social democracy. You have the Beveridge Report and the NHS in Britain after the Second World War. There's really a number of reasons for this. I mean, the spirit of the Second World War sort of lived on. People wanted to help each other out. There's less of a tendency for individualism because everyone had come together during the war. At the same time, it could be argued that capitalists, because they feared the growth of the Soviet Union, the growth of communism, were willing to give a lot of concessions to workers. They were willing to give them a strong welfare state. They were willing to have a lot of equality, high taxation rates on the rich. There was also the thing that most of the world was bombed out, and so somewhere like America and Europe could afford to have very high taxation rates on the rich, because where else were they going to go? Now, neoliberalism in the 1970s is a return to disembedded markets, redisembedded markets, and it starts in the 70s. And so neoliberalism was all about disembedding liberalism, which I think is an important concept for what we're now witnessing. So the post-war consensus of Keynesian social democracy comes into trouble in the 70s. You start to have problems of inflation, of rising debt. And the business community begins to finance free market ideologues like von Hayek and Milton Friedman. And this really was a concerted effort by the business community, by the capitalist class, if you want to call them that, to pool resources together to promote free market ideas in the US. And of course, it spread to the rest of the world. And the result is neoliberalism, which emphasizes the value of the free market. People will be familiar with these ideas if anyone has seen, which they probably have, the suggested YouTube videos, Milton Friedman's own talks, the market was the solution to everything. The wonder of the pencil that was so difficult to manufacture, but everyone's sort of working in self-interest. The miracle of the free market can produce this for so cheap, all this kind of thing. These ideas become popular again. So neoliberalism really was about transferring control of economic factors to the private sector. You have huge privatization under people like Maggie Thatcher. You have organizations today like the IMF that go into countries that are debt-ridden and force them to privatize things like water and utilities and so on. It extends the market into areas previously controlled by the state, And you have austerity, privatization, deregulation, free trade, and reduced role of government. This is the sort of common wisdom of neoliberalism. Now, the problem with disembedding liberalism is the state becomes subservient to capital. And this is the long-term effect of neoliberalism. Once markets are no longer embedded, once capital becomes this international force and we start to move to an international free market, because, free trade, according to the neoliberals, will, a rising tide lifts all boats, and free trade will ultimately be in everyone's interest. We'll get the most efficient possible market. The problem is you have corporations that now become international in size and scope, and increasingly states have to focus on their own market competitiveness rather than national competition. Instead of countries competing with each other in terms of their own native industry and growth and so on, now it's about being more competitive than the country next to you. What that means is being more attractive for international capital to do business in, with low taxation, deregulation, and so on. Instead of dismantling monopolies, you have states aiding and creating private monopolies. The example I picked is Huawei in China. China chose Huawei as a national champion in the 1990s. It gave it subsidies, it gives it easy access to credit and finance, and cooperation with the military and intelligence services. And this is increasingly the model we're seeing, is in order to be competitive on the global markets, increasingly one corporation dominates everything. And so increasingly what states have to do is, well, they're not going to dismantle monopolies, or some other country's monopoly is just going to take over. So what China does is they just pick the best person in that sector and they say, okay, you can be the monopoly, you can go out and compete on the world stage, and we'll give you lots of public finances to do so. For smaller states, it's a bit different. Smaller states like Ireland have to orient their economy around attracting multinational corporations. And this is exactly what Ireland did. The low corporation tax of 12.5%, setting up things like the Industrial Development Authority that exists to try and attract corporations. And you get this problem, which is this race to the bottom, where small countries start undercutting each other. Ireland has a 12.5% corporation tax. So America lowered its corporation tax under Trump to try and attract companies back from Ireland. Maybe another country will undercut Ireland, have an 8% corporation tax. Ireland doesn't force corporations to pay all the taxes they owe. There's all these loopholes. Other small countries will set up loopholes to attract capital like that. And it becomes this race to the bottom, where now that capital is disembedded, and now that it's international, every country becomes like an individual competing in the open market. And that's problematic in terms of what that means for the people, because it's no longer possible to make these capitalists subservient to the state. It's no longer possible to tax them in a fair way. It's a race to the bottom. The possibility of taxing the rich or regulating companies becomes limited by the threat of capital flight. This is the obvious thing. People say, like in the US, like, well, we used to have a 90% tax on the rich at the time Kennedy was president. So we need a wealth tax, and why not just cap wealth at $100 million, whatever. But increasingly the problem is the rich can just move, and if a country does that, they'll probably get less taxation in the long run because so many people will move. And this is a problem of disembedded liberalism. And this ultimately was always the point of the neoliberal reforms. This is what the people financing it wanted. They didn't want to be subservient to the state. They didn't want embedded markets. And so there are all these tendencies that lead to that are in globalism that necessarily lead to oligarchy. One of the things to understand is complex networks, and globalism leads to the growth of many new complex networks. The complex networks are networks with interconnected nodes, basically. That's what a network is. A complex network is a network that has an element of choice and growth and preferential attachment. So there are biological examples of complex networks. There are swarms, various biological systems. But the growth of globalism combined with technology leads to a lot of complex networks that serve as business models. Now, the internet is an example, but a good example is Twitter. And what does this mean? Well, The problem with this is, we have this vision of capitalism that it's all about competition and multiple small businesses competing. The problem with businesses like Twitter and social media and Google search engines and so on is that because they're complex networks, they tend to fall into a winner take all power distribution. Now, this has been much studied, and basically, the analysis says that complex networks over time will become winner take all. One person will come out on top, one node will come out on top. First place tends to have more than twice as much as second place, and then second place will have 2 or 3 times or 4 times as much as third place, and then usually everyone else has a small, tiny fraction of the market. A good example is search engines. Google 92%, Bing less than 3%, Yahoo about 1.5%, and the rest, quite they hardly count in terms of the share they have. So this is much more pronounced in the kind of big tech businesses that are made possible by globalism, and in the fact that markets become globalized, the winner take all effect is exacerbated. The value of being the best is exacerbated because of feedback loops on a global scale. Now, an example of how feedback loops feed winner take all power distributions, you can think of, a feedback loop is just where the output has a relation to the input. So you can think of, a best-selling novel. If you write a novel, it sells however many copies. Once it becomes a bestseller, then it's suggested to people, then people write about it, then it has bestseller written on the cover. And so then many more people will buy it, maybe twice as many people will buy it as before it became bestseller. So because the output makes you a winner in that market, you then get a huge more amount of sales. So these two things are related. Another example is fame. People that are famous for being famous. Someone like Kim Kardashian becomes famous, and then there's this feedback loop where people don't know why she's famous, but she's famous, and she becomes famous for being famous, and that makes her more famous. Marketing is global, but the number of champions is static. So to use an example, you can think of like football, soccer, that there was always like a best player in a country, and they'd be popular in that country, and they'd get advertisement deals and TV show appearances and so on, and they can make money that way. But it would have been more evenly spread. But as things become global, as everyone gets access to the internet, and everyone is watching the Champions League and the World Cup on their TVs in whatever country they're in, there's the same amount of champions. There's still the one best player in the world. There's still the one team that are world champions. But the market is bigger. So, the best player in the world in the 1970s makes a hell of a lot less money than the best player in the world in 2021 because the market's expanded. And proportionally, probably the best player in an individual country really makes less as a proportion of the global scale, because more and more people aren't focused on their local leagues, they're focusing on international leagues. Media and technology exacerbates this because it costs the same to stream the number 1 versus number 2 tennis player than the number 200 versus 201st ranked player. And so there's constantly this tendency in globalism with technology, with the global market, for everything to converge on champions, on the winners, the best in whatever category. And the more items in the network, the more for those at the top. And so we're constantly seeing the growth of global brands. But it's exacerbated by technology in that we've always had global brands under at least 20th century capitalism, but you have Coke and Pepsi and soft drinks. I think Coke has maybe 3-4 times the market of Pepsi, but there isn't really a Pepsi for YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. And that's because they're much more winner-take-all markets. Because I'm going to go on Twitter because Twitter is the public square. It's because that's where everyone is. Because Twitter is the winner in that market, that's why people go there. Because it's the most popular, it remains the most popular, because being the most popular is the selling point. So there's no Pepsi to any of these. I mean, you have things like Gab and BitChute, but this is largely for people that have been sort of excluded from these platforms. And if someone is deciding to make an account, in terms of if they're going to choose between Twitter or Gab, they're not going to look at what is the better interface, which one is going to collect their data more. It's largely going to be a case of, well, I'm going on Twitter to get my voice heard in the public square, and everyone's on Twitter, so I'm going to go on Twitter. So you can see how technology really tends to exacerbate winner-take-all power distributions. In the case of social media, being the public square is the selling point. What we also have is the growth of a rentier economy. And this is, again, something that's touched on a lot in the way people are describing things are going. You know, you'll own nothing, you'll have nothing. Everyone will rent apartments, they'll rent box rooms, and they'll own nothing, they'll have nothing to pass on to their kids. Everyone is kind of noticing this tendency. The traditional form of production capitalism is being replaced by the service economy. And increasingly, the means of revenue for capitalists is fees, charges, license fees. And that coincides with the growth of platform capitalism, where capitalists make money just by owning a platform, whether it's Airbnb, Uber, whatever. But you can see that more and more people are spending their money on things like fees, charges, license fees, copyright, patents. More and more people pay for subscription services, Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime, whatever, and they're not getting any physical product for what they're buying, and the capitalists that are making money off that are basically selling control of information. The Amazon Prime are selling that they have the control of copyright and the right to distribute various movie titles and so on. Resources are becoming monopolized by new lords, while there's precarious existence for the masses. And this is why there's this neo-feudal tendency that's been described, is things are again being defined by economic relationships. The state is no longer the ultimate sovereign, and there's a sharp division between the lords and the peasants are largely reliant on handouts from the lords in order to survive. Personal property is even becoming a means of income with things like Uber and Airbnb. Your car or your spare room becomes a means of income. Everything is becoming economized for the peasant class. And again, to tie this back to why I describe this as a neo-feudal stage of capitalism, the workers are becoming peasants through double extraction. In feudalism, peasants were doubly exploited in that they had to pay tithe on the land that they rented from the lord, and they also paid for the use of water mills, to grind their grain. The lord would own the land, but he'd also own the water mills, so you want to grind the grain that you've grown, and you have to pay a fee to use the water mill, and you don't have a choice in that because there's a monopoly in the water mill. So in this way, the peasants were exploited in multiple ways by the economic relations of feudalism. And we're witnessing a similar thing happening now, in that customers of platform capitalism are both the consumer and the product. You both pay a fee to Airbnb to use their service, and they collect data on you. They collect your location, they collect what kind of ads you're interested in, and so on. And this applies to all the big tech companies. You are both the consumer and the product. They pool people's data together and they sell it to other big corporations so that they can figure out how best to market to you. So there's, again, multiple forms of exploitation of the worker rather than just wage labor, for example. What we also have that's feudal in its tendency is the division of sovereignty. And this is what characterized feudalism, as it came after the collapse of the Roman Empire, where there was a very centralized imperium. And feudalism was really filling the vacuum that was left by the collapse of empire. And so there was all these sort of localized economic relations that filled that gap. You have the blending of public and private now. Rights don't extend to the private sphere. Section 230 doesn't get enforced on private companies. You have a right to go to a shopping mall and express a dissident political point of view, but you can't do it on Twitter, and the government won't protect you when the capitalists deplatform you for doing so. It's gone to the point they even have the power to basically unperson people. They can do it to the president of the United States. He was getting his personal bank accounts closed, all his social media shut down. He's basically being unpersoned. And this is a right this is a power that we always imagined was reserved for the government. 1984, the origin of that term unpersoning. People never really imagined that you would have private companies with the ability to do this, and it would be more effective and more powerful than the government in many ways, and that they can close your bank accounts. How do you live without a bank account in modern society? So the oligarchs now decide who enters the public square, to the point that they interfere in elections. And again, this is to kind of tie back to the neo-feudal nature of where capitalism is going, is that feudalism was very much characterized by sort of arbitration, multiple forms of law. As we moved out of feudalism, as you get the Westphalian states, you have the states as the ultimate arbiter of law. You have a conception of international law of some sort. But we're moving back to, again, there being private law, arbitration, the state not being the final arbiter on these things. And a perfect example is wealth funds that can sue nation states. You have vulture funds like the one that was run by Peter Singer, or is it Paul Singer, that sued sovereign nations in Latin America. They buy up bad debt belonging to these countries, and then when they don't pay it, they sue them for hundreds of millions of dollars in international courts to get money off them. And that's a relation that's, I think, hard for some people to get their heads around, that private venture capitalists in the US can sue however many million people live in Argentina. But again, it's this division of sovereignty between private and public, and the lessening of the state as the final arbiter. And you also have surveillance capitalism, of course. We know that the NSA, the CIA work closely with the big tech companies. They wouldn't let really a foreign competitor replace Facebook or Twitter because they work so closely with them. And you have your data constantly being collected, every area of your life. And this is the natural form of technology under capitalism now. What we also have is the growth of hinterlands. And again, this is the neo-feudal tendency. We all have this, I think, idea of feudalism, where there is kind of wild lands. There's like bandit country, places where your carriage get robbed or whatever. You can see this expressed as well in sci-fi, I think, a lot. There's always this idea of like the hinterlands, the borderlands, the wasteland, where there's a city, there's like a multicultural, cosmopolitan, very polluted city, and there's huge skyscrapers. Think of something like Blade Runner, and the oligarchs, the remaining oligarchs, live in those skyscrapers, sort of looking out on the world they control. And then there's like outside the city that still has businesses and so on, and some kind of thriving society. There's the hinterlands, there's the badlands, where things are kind of unpoliced. There's a lot of desperation. Well, it's interesting that a lot of that sci-fi was written and created in the 70s and 80s at the beginning of neoliberalism. It's almost like there's this tendency that's always been there, that some people could kind of see the logical endpoint of this. And we again have the growth of hinterlands. Medieval cities were dominated by oligarchies that were made rich of financial services to nobility, to kings, to the church, to lords, and so on. Neo-feudalism is now leading to desolate rural areas. And at the same time, you have cosmopolitan cities with intense concentration of wealth. Again, America is the perfect example for most of this because it's further along than the rest of the world. But, cosmopolitan cities like San Francisco and New York. And it was actually, Dugan wrote a paper before the American election about how there's two Americas now. There's the heartland America, as he described it, that's still conservative, that's still religious, that's still nationalist, that is still reliant on and attached to an older form of production, of manufacturing. And then there's the coastal America, where coastal elites live cosmopolitan, liberal, internationalist values. There's always been this division between, the seafaring powers like the British Empire that were more liberal in their outlook, and the landlocked areas like, Prussia, that was more based on military valor and masculine values and so on. But this urban-rural divide is becoming very sharp under neo-feudalism. increasingly you have hinterlands that are sustained by secondary services and public sector. You have places where, it's just maybe a couple of diners and an Amazon warehouse. In places like rural Ireland, increasingly there's a loss of services, hospitals, post offices, police stations being closed down as everything gets centralised. And at the same time, you have the growth of Dublin into this international cosmopolitan financial centre, characterised by the liberal values of people living there. And you have hinterlands that are plagued by drug abuse, suicide, poverty, and lack of basic services. And again, these are the people that voted for Obama in 2012. They voted for Trump in 2016. We hear about the Rust Belt, places where manufacturing has declined. You've an opioid epidemic among demographics that would have never been thought possible, really. And you have working poor people really suffering in these areas, and they really feel largely left behind by the cosmopolitan city centres. And there becomes this sharp political divide as well as economic divide between the hinterlands and the cosmopolitan centres. The values of people in the hinterlands are so fundamentally different increasingly from the people in the cosmopolitan centres, especially as they accelerate more and more into liberalism. And at the same time, cosmopolitanism and the values of these economic centres are being spread globally by Atlanticism, by American financial empire, as a way to kind of colonize new areas of the world by spreading cosmopolitan values and liberalism and free exchange and the capitalism that comes with it. At the same time, we also have religious revivals, and this is another thing that was witnessed a lot in the Middle Ages, where you have all sorts of millenarian religious revivals. You've all sorts of prophets popping up, apocalypticism, and we're seeing all this again. Ed Dutton has talked about this a lot, and he writes that religious revivals appear to occur when the kind of situation that would lead to a period of religiousness in an individual, such as stress and mortality salience, are experienced relatively suddenly by a substantial portion of society. And what also happens is, there was always there's plenty of examples of religious revivals in the Middle Ages that they were maybe confined to one area, like there was a very famous one in the south of Germany. But what happens now with social media is revivals that would otherwise be isolated become global. And oftentimes that's inflamed by the oligarchs. You have wokeness that mimics in many ways a kind of post-Christian heresy. You have the growth of collapse cult stuff and left environmentalism that's very apocalyptic, that seems to reflect the revival of apocalypticism. I mean, when you look at the way Extinction Rebellion behave at some of their demonstrations, there is something very quasi-religious about it in a way. And you have the millenarianism of things like QAnon. There'll be a day of rapture, everything will be saved, there'll be this, the savior, divinity incarnate will rescue us, and things will go back to a golden age. So all of these things reflect this kind of religious revivalism. Now, what's the role of the left in all this? So I've included this picture, that in 2011 leftists were outside Wall Street or outside Goldman Sachs, all these companies, Occupy Wall Street, we are the 99%. And you can see mentions of racism after 2010 absolutely skyrocket. And the oligarchs shift to, racism is the only problem we face. They shift to bourgeois identity politics. And this is what happened. This is a means of pacifying the left and turning them into useful idiots for the oligarchs. The left is now primarily a vehicle of bourgeois identity politics. And this is why I almost think it's almost giving them too much credit to think that this is a communist revolution, or that this is still about moving to a communist utopia. I think many of them will identify as communist, but so does China right now. And China certainly isn't a communist state by any reasonable metric. But it almost gives them too much credit, because they are just bourgeois servants of capital. They do the bidding of capitalism in breaking down barriers to profiteering and breaking down traditional barriers to profit, like traditional social norms and nationalism and so on. And this is a characteristic of neocolonialism. So colonialism is, a form of extraction from other groups where it relies on force. But what happened at some point in the 20th century was we had this shift to neocolonialism where it became about the capitalists, the oligarchs started focusing on manufacturing consent rather than, using the British Army to maintain consent through coercion. And this is done under the cloak of and using the language of leftist utopianism. So the oligarchs want a global marketplace of atomized consumers. Maybe stress that this is what I believe we're moving towards. This is the end goal. The ideologues of neoliberalism, people like Mark Zuckerberg, people like Jeff Bezos, their goal, their dream is ultimately the same. It's a global village, a global marketplace where no one is judged by the color of their skin. No one is judged by anything that's inborn, and everyone gets a chance to enter the global marketplace. So it is utopian in that sense. It's not utopian in the Marxist way of that the means of production are collectively owned, but it is utopian in the way that a Milton Friedman would have seen it, that everyone enters as an economic unit into this, and you have the maximum amount of efficiency because traditional barriers to profit and to free trade are eliminated. Now that translates nicely into the language of anti-racism, egalitarianism, individualism, internationalism. Instead of we want to do away with borders and have a maximally efficient pool of labor to recruit from, it becomes about anti-racism, and we have to welcome people, and people that are opposed, people that are for any immigration restriction must be racist, white supremacists, whatever. Egalitarianism, it's having a multicultural sort of work environment and being able to recruit anyone and being able to bring women into the workforce and so on, and turn everyone into a wage slave. That can be cloaked under the language of egalitarianism. It's liberation for these people. It's again, you're bigoted. We have to get rid of bigotry in the workplace and make everyone welcome. We have to make everyone welcome as an atomized consumer in the global marketplace. And of course, individualism, for obvious reasons, and the internationalism of the left. It's all one international proletarian struggle against the capitalists, and actually divisions of nationalism, of religion. These are all illusory. They're created by the bourgeoisie to oppress us. They're all ideological spooks. Well, that ties in nicely to what the oligarchs believe, because the oligarchs also believe in internationalism. They call it globalism. They call it free trade. They call it, doing away with the nation state as a tool that can keep them in line. So the language of leftist utopianism is a perfect fit for the neocolonial project of the oligarchs, and that's why they embrace it, and they use it to destroy traditional barriers to profit. We've also seen in the last few years the growth of whiteness studies and critical race theory. And what this does is it passes blame for colonialism from the oligarchs to white people collectively. Instead of people recognizing this colonial process, like I'm doing now, and that's something that we could all collectively come around and say, let's get these colonial capitalist oligarchs out of power and have nation states that work for the people. They pass the blame for colonialism to people that are, in many cases, justified for resentment for a colonial history. They passed the blame for that. It wasn't the fault of merchant capitalists. It wasn't the fault of the Masonic elites that ran the British Empire or whatever. It's actually all the fault of white people, and working class white people are actually to blame for colonialism and for oppression, and white people are inherently a colonial people. And so they use this to justify their current dispossession. Leftist intolerance also justifies overreach of private actors and the silencing of dissent. And I don't think this even needs stressing. I mean, just look at the reaction to a sitting president of the United States being deplatformed, being unpersoned. Any other time, everyone would have said, we have a problem here. We have a problem that Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg get to decide elections, and they get to decide who's allowed to speak. And they have more power than the government. Now it's, oh great, the evil orange fascist got silenced and the leftists cheered on. But again, this is quite an obvious point. And also, political correctness excludes the working class from discourse. Political correctness is constantly shifting. Terms are constantly changing. People are made to feel ignorant for using terms that were acceptable 2 years ago. And there's a point to that. It's a form of social capital to be able to keep up with political correctness. It's reserved for the bourgeois, it's reserved for the middle class and the upper class. And it excludes the working class from being allowed to have a say. It's a very cynical way to keep the conversation to certain kinds of people. Now, as far as response to this goes, this is just a short point, but the limits of parochialism. Now, I am a nationalist, and this is not an argument against nationalism, actually. But what it is an argument against is the idea that, being overly... sometimes people's optimism can lead them to, I think, bad conclusions, and that people say, well, all we need to do is, just in this one country, we can just elect the government and kick out whoever and return to a kind of traditional moral, religious, whatever nation state. I think we have to accept that that's the idea of one state just going its own way out of the international order isn't really possible under this system because of the scope and power of financial empire and the huge international scope of the oligarchs. There's no longer, the merchant caste is no longer subservient to any state. You can't, they're not just going to tolerate one, say Ireland just coming into power and saying, well, Google and Apple and PayPal, you all have to live according to our values now, and we're going to raise the taxation, and we're going to build industry and have a more production focused economy. Because the market is so disembedded now, that's not really possible. And their power is so great that they can just buy up the media. They can use the CIA. They can use American military power. They can use NATO. And they can just effectively stop any nation state from going its own way and leaving the international order. The examples of countries that seem to have done this are largely countries that are sandwiched between the order of NATO and Russia and can kind of play the two great powers off against each other. But as far as one country just going its own way, fundamental transformation is not really possible with the power of oligarchs currently. And Western nations have moved to post-industrial economies. So even if a country did do this and went their own way, all the capital flees. What are you going to do? Are you just going to start, building manufacturing plants? This is specifically a problem with the referencing back to the 1930s. Is people say, well, look at Germany, look at Italy. They were under the thumb of international finance, and they raised themselves up to be nationalist states that were rejected the global order. Well, that may be true, but at the same time, there was an Atlanticist liberal order at that time, but those countries were never fully integrated into it. And there was also a nationalist capitalist class that kind of benefited from nationalism. There were industrialists in those countries that weren't really attached to liberalism, didn't really want free trade, and they actually benefited more from having a national state, or they certainly didn't work as hard to try and scupper that. Now the merchant class money power is completely internationalist. It's completely bought into globalism, and they will do everything to stop a state sort of going their own way and being a good example to other nations. So global capitalism has to be dismantled in order to return to embedded markets. And now again, this is not to say that we should all become globalists and we should just give up on nationalism or whatever. That's not all what I'm saying. But the kind of parochialism where people say, well, I don't care what's happening in the world. I don't care who cares about any of this stuff that's going on in America. Let's just we'll just vote in a nationalist party, and we'll just we'll just sort of have things functioning the way they always did in terms of economic structures and so on. But the point is, the market has really moved beyond that, and disembedded markets can't really be brought back to being embedded by one nation state for the reasons I've talked about. And so the point is, it's not just blackpilling for the sake of it. I mean, the point is that we have to get to the root of the problem. We have to remove the oligarchs from power. No fundamental transformation is possible. No kind of national survival. No kind of traditionalist revival. No fundamental change, of course, is possible until the billionaires and technocrats that are in power are completely removed. And that's why anti-globalism ultimately is a global struggle. But maybe that's for another day. So yeah, I hope you appreciated this. That's my basic breakdown of where we are. I welcome disagreements and discussion on this, and I think there's a lot of this that needs to be further developed. A lot of concepts in here that deserve their own treatment. But it is to say that what we're witnessing is a kind of neo-feudal epoch of capitalism, just as there's been a liberal epoch, a classical liberal, an epoch that was Keynesian and social democratic, and a neoliberal epoch, and now neoliberalism is transforming into a neo-feudal epoch of capitalism. But it is still fundamentally capitalist. It is still capital that is driving this process. It is still the internationalist capitalist oligarchs that are driving this, and opposition has to be focused on them. We can't live in illusion. We can't feed people lies. We have to have the best understanding, the best explanation of what's going on, and we have to realize that there is no solution until the rot is dealt with, and until the focus goes to the people that are controlling the levers of power, and ultimately the economic process that is constantly driving this forward in search of perpetual growth. And that's what I've attempted to show today. So thanks for joining. Take care. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Peace out.